Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Council. Thank you, SSE. I was able to tie a tie in 10 seconds. It would look good. Nowadays, it takes a little longer. But I have 50 minutes, I gather, but I want to take some time to reminisce about SSE. And this morning, I was reminded of the works of Dalai Lama. Sometimes not getting what you want is a wonderful stroke of luck. And that takes me back to the beginning when I worked for a best part of a year to write an analysis of the Condon report, sent it to about 5 different journals, came back by return post, rejected. And Bob John had similar experience. And it occurred to me that if the journals had accepted everything I wrote, everything Bob wrote, we wouldn't have needed SSE. But of course, we still have the same problem. And the main purpose of SSE was originally to found a journal, and the journal is going wonderfully well. So I think, Bob, here we could say that our dreams have come true. We were assisted enormously early on by University of Virginia. Charlie Talbot and Larry Frederick, Ian Stevenson played very important roles in the beginning of the society. And then after a few years, we were able to found the journal. And Henry Bauer was our first editor, I believe, followed by Bernie Heisch and Marcia Sims, if they are here, but they played very important roles in getting the journal up and running. And now we're very lucky to have Steve Bauer and Kathleen Erickson running our journal. I also would like to recognize Patrick Huij, who produces Edge Science for us once or twice a year. All right, so now on to Shakespeare. Here we are. The first slide is up, and I have co-authors here. I'm preparing an article. Hopefully, Steve will accept it. We'll see. But it's the work I'm presenting, done in cooperation with Kathleen, who has been helping me prepare the manuscript, and with 2 English mathematicians, Jonathan Bond and David Roper. Let's take a look at what Shakespeare is supposed to look like. And let me see if I can get this slide. Oh, here we are. This is what you would see if you went to the alleged birthplace of Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire in England. And I'm told this, after London, this is the 2nd most visited city in England. Well, where did this picture of, somebody said he looks like a self-satisfied pork butcher. I don't know whether that's a fair statement or not, but that is what someone says. Where did this picture come from? Well, if there's an official origin, it would be the first folio. And this is the portrait produced by Droschut, who was a young man at the time, on the first folio, and there are all kinds of problems with it. If you look at David Roper's book, you'll find 10 problems with this picture. For instance, the collar has no fastener. You wonder how he ever got it on. The forehead is far too big. The nose is too long. One of the most egregious errors is that if you look at the right shoulder, what you're seeing is really the rear of the left shoulder. So there are many problems with this, and there are so many that they could not be accidental. This had to be a spoof. And who's behind the spoof? Well, certainly Ben Jonson was spoof-in-chief, but he was responding to the wishes of the noblemen who were behind this production. So there we are. There's a Droschut picture. And what else do we have? Well, if we look back, we'll find that there was an engraving made in 1656 of a portrait sketched by the antiquarian William Dugdale in 1634, I believe. And this is the image you'd see next to the purported grave of Shakespeare in the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. Well, he looks kind of a dour man. He doesn't bear much relationship to the pork butcher, does he? And what is he holding? He's holding a woolsack. Well, a poet and wordsmith and playwright holding a woolsack? How come? That's a puzzle, isn't it? And the next one is the actual portrait sketched by Dugdale at the church. So that's all we have until in the last few years, another portrait has surfaced called the Sanders portrait, purportedly sketched in 1603 of the man from Stratford. I'm going to use the word Shakespeare for the man from Stratford-on-Avon, because that's the term he usually used, always with a short A, Shakespeare, or Shak with a K or with an X or whatever. Never use the word Shakespeare with an E, and still less with a hyphen. So here is the Sanders portrait. At least this looks like a real person. He looks a little younger than 30 years old, but one can imagine that he's a real person. One can imagine that he might be a bit of a rogue, a likable one, but who knows? I think the jury is out as to whether this really is a genuine portrait of the man from Stratford. Now, as you may know, there have been many alternative candidates for the role of Shakespeare. One was Delia Bacon, but there are many others. But the current running candidate is Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. And he was pinpointed by, go back a bit. This is his portrait painted in Paris, I believe, in 1575, when he was making a visit to the royal court. Obviously quite a dandy, but he was brought up in the home of Lord Burleigh, who was one of the most richest men in London, also the power behind the throne. He had one of the biggest libraries in Europe at that time. And so also de Vere had a magnificent education with private lawyers, private tutors to start with, and then followed by some years at Cambridge and at Oxford. And then, of course, he traveled extensively in Europe, spending over a year in Italy. Well, to get another reading on him, let's look at his writing. Well, we don't have any writing by him. All we have are 5 purported signatures on 5 different legal documents. And experts who look at this say they were not all written by this. Well, why pairs? Well, if a person was illiterate and could not sign his name, the practice was that a law clerk would sign him for him, and he had to swear that that was his signature. Well, I think, let me see. Let's see if I can get the... Oh, here we are. So this, and this are thought to be signatures by the same man. Purportedly by the same man. Experts say they are so dissimilar that they can hardly be all by the same man. So there's a problem with the picture. There's a problem with the signatures. Let's go to de Vere, beautiful signature. And on top, he always signed it with a crown, as shown here. until the death of the Queen. When the Queen died, he stopped using the crown on top of his signature, which is a puzzle. I'd like to know exactly why. And now let's look at some of his. This is written by him at age 14 from Paris to his guardian, Lord Burleigh. Since De Vere's father died when De Vere was 12, he became a ward of the Queen, and the Queen allotted him to the care of Lord Burleigh. Well, supposing we were a scientist, what we would do, we'd try to see what the facts are and see how the facts align with the expectation. And so let's do that. Let's start with the cryptograms I'll come to at the end. But let's start with the knowledge of English history. No doubt from the plays, the author had a magnificent understanding of history. Oxford would have had an excellent understanding of history too. Well, what about Shakespeare? We don't know if he ever went to school. If he did, it was just for 3 or 4 years in a town school. So we don't know how much. He probably did not learn much about English history there. And let's go on to falconry. I mean, there are many references, intricate references to the sport of falconry, which is a noble sport in the works of Shakespeare. And we know that Oxford was very, very skilled as a falconer. Shakespeare, he can't have it. It was a noble sport. He simply could not have known anything about falconry by experience. Similarly, for France and French, excellent knowledge by the author, excellent by Oxford, little or none by Shakespeare. And so on. One can go on right through this list, and you'll find that there's a very good correspondence between what you expect of the true author and what you find in the plays and poems, and a very poor correspondence, if any, with the gentleman from Stratford-upon-Avon. But now I want to begin talking about the sonnets and the dedication of the sonnets. It was published in 1609. It had a very brief life history. I don't know how, it was sold by 2 booksellers, and probably many hundreds were printed up, but they were all rapidly recovered by the state, and only 13 managed to survive. So one big question is, why was the state so adverse to having Shakespeare's sonnets published? One of the remaining problems for us. And what comes next? Yes, there are many questions. I think I missed the key. This is the title page, yes. Now I want the dedication. Here's the dedication. It begins with a dedication to the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness, and that eternity promised by our everlasting poet wisheth the well-wishing adventurer in setting forth, initials T.T. Well, English scholars don't know what to make of this. And there are of 3 big books on the sonnet dedication. 2 do not mention dedication at all. The one by Helen Vendler does not even, well, 2 make no comments on it, but they at least reproduce it. The one by Helen Vendler, hundreds of pages on the sonnets, doesn't even reproduce the dedication. What do they assume? They assume that TT are the initials of Thomas Thorpe, the publisher, and so they assume that the dedication we see here was written by Thomas Thorpe. It's referred to as Thorpe's dedication. Well, we'll see that is absolute nonsense. So among the questions are the following: who was the only begetter? Who was our ever-living poet? Who was the well-wishing adventurer? What was the adventure? Where was he setting forth to? And scholars focus on who was Mr. W.H. Well, we shall find that the problem here rises in large part from the assumption that the dedication was written by Thomas Thorpe. And so it's referred to as Thorpe's dedication. And so the scholars say, well, what did Thorpe have in mind when he referred to the only begetter, the ever-loving poet, and so on? Well, we have to drop that assumption. We have to drop the assumption that it was written by Thomas Thorpe and follow the evidence wherever it may lead. So here is the title page of the Here we are. Here's the title page, and we've gone through that. The candidates by the Orthodox scholars are that the only begetter was let's see. Was the great author Shakespeare, or the person who procured the manuscript for Thorpe. And the big question here, who had the manuscript to give to the publishers? It may have been the person who inspired the sonnets. And here enters the character of the Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley. He is the only person mentioned by name in any of the author's writings. In his two long poems, Venus and Adonis and Raven Lucrece, he dedicates them to the Earl of Southampton in a very colourful way. So let's look at this dedication once more. Okay. One thing to notice is that there are periods, full stops, scattered throughout the dedication. 2 full stop, 3 full stop, only full stop, etc., and so on. And now let's go on to the first person to really come to grips with the dedication, who's an engineer, electrical engineer named John Rowlett, who passed away a few years ago at the Post Office Research Station in Dollis Hill in London. And he became interested in this because an author had purported to have solved who W.H. was, and I forget, a very complicated story, but Rowlett found that hard to swallow. But then he thought, well, it's a very peculiar dedication. Maybe there is something hidden there after all. It's not the solution that I was presented with, but there could be something there. And so he then began counting, and then he drew attention to all the periods that, well, maybe the rule is to take every other name, every other word, or every third word, and so on. And that didn't get anywhere. And but eventually, he took note of the fact that the dedication laid out in 3 triangles. The first one of 6 lines, then of 2 lines, our ever-living poet, and then of 4 lines, which is down to 4th. Well, 6, 2, 4, that is interesting. After all, Edward de Vere has a 6-letter word, a 2-letter word, and a 4-letter word. And so this begins to become interesting. Now, Jonathan Bond, a current analyst of this problem, he takes note of, I missed a very important point here. I've got to go back. Here we are. If you take the 6th word, then the 2nd word, and then the 4th word, what you get is these sonnets all by, and the next one is ever. Well, when John Rowlett saw this, he thought, well, I've drawn a blank again. I don't know of any playwright named Ever. There's no Mr. Ever mentioned in anything I've come across. Only later did he, by chance, note that a prime candidate for the authorship of Shakespeare was Edward de Vere, initial E, and the surname Vere came from the family name in France of Ver. So Ever obviously could be taken to indicate Edward de Vere. Jonathan Bond takes it a little further, and he says, if you keep going, you end up with these sonnets all by Ever the Fourth. And Rowlett saw that, but he didn't know what he could be the fourth of. Actually, the Queen's Privy Council had a number of members with names very carefully ordered, and the fourth in order was Edward de Vere. So it may have been referring to his role in the Queen's Council. So, the question then is, and here's where science comes in. Was the sequence of names, of words, these sonnets all by Ever, was that by chance? One can check that out. One can begin scrambling the words and then pick out 7 words and then put them in the right order and see what it sounds like. And I've done that with collaboration for a few thousand times, and you don't find any line that makes any kind of sense. So, with a probability of less than 1 part in 1,000, you can say that dedication was planned deliberately to point to Ever, E-V-E-R-E, meaning Edward de Vere. Now, anyway, this got Rowlett obviously enthusiastic. So he then began, well, what other ways are there to hide messages in text like this? And one is called equidistant spacing. And the way you track this down is to form a rectangle, and then you write the actual text, beginning with line 1, line 2, line 3, and so on. Then what you do is look at the columns and say, is there anything interesting in the columns? And when he did this, it didn't take him long to find, yes, there is. I find the word Henry right in the middle of this chart. Henry was the first name of Edward of the Earl of Southampton. He is the prime candidate for the fair man of the Sonnets. Here we are. His fourth discovery, really tricky. But anyway, once you get this far, you're going to really pay attention to what you find. And in this array, I think it's 16 by something, you find down here WR, here ESLEY, or WYELSE, and then ESLEY. You find the word Rosalie, WRIOTHESLEY, which is the surname of the Earl of Southampton. So in these 2 grids, you find the full name of the only person ever named by the author in print, who is the prime candidate for the fair use of the sonnets. There we are. This is where Jonathan Bond, the English mathematician, comes in. He looked at this more carefully and said, well, actually, Rowlett saw something he didn't see at all. If you look at, you will see it begins with 2, and it spells out in the sequence 2 espy. Here we are. It spells out 2 espy off Riosley wit need not here sight, which is a kind of a complicated way of saying if you're smart, you can find Rosely often in these sonnets. So this it's amazing. It's amazing to me how complicated this dedication becomes. It's amazing how many little messages the author packs into this 144 letters. I mean, before I looked at the cryptograms, I knew Shakespeare, the real Shakespeare, was a very, very clever man. My opinion of him shot up still further when I began to see what he'd packed into this dedication. And anyway, we can now do a little science, a little more science, and we can now say, well, what's the chance that this word Rosely happened by chance? And you can do that mathematically. You can look at the number of letters of each character and how many. There are 4 letters W in 144. That leaves 9 letters R in the remaining 143, and so on. You can then find the probability of finding that name in a specified number of letters, but then you've got to take account of the fact that there are many ways of picking 11 letters out of these 144. And so when you take that into account, you find the probability that this name, Rosely cleared by chance, was 7 times 10 to the minus 6. So it's tough to imagine that that happened by chance. But then Bond made another discovery that, it's rather a complicated one. I won't spend much time on this. He found that one can find in this, in a different array, the sequence, let rosy lip poet ape alone. Well, it happened there'd been a kind of argument between Shakespeare, the author, and Ben Jonson, and a poem that Ben Jonson wrote used the term rosy lips. No, he used the term a poet ape. In one of his sonnets, Shakespeare uses the word rosy lip. So this may be a kind of a word play between Ben Jonson and the true author. But now we come to the last message, which is incredible in my mind. Anyone expecting to find a hidden message in a block of text would first look at the square and look at the center of the square. Rowlett did that. He did not find anything that looked at all interesting. And he concluded there was nothing in the 12 by 12 grid. Well, he knew Latin. Jonathan Bond also knew Latin. And Rowlett missed, but Bond picked up this fact. You find there the words pro pare votis emerita. Obviously, the author is playing games in Latin with his recipient. And what does it mean? Well, there's no clear understanding of exactly the sequence, but some of the terms mean, some of the words mean well-deserving, others mean praying to earn your affection, your well-deserving father, etc. And there's a possibility that Southampton was in fact the son of Earl of Oxford by the Queen. So again, one can go through what's the chance of this happening by chance, what's the probability, and one can go through the calculations, a whole sequence to go through. But what you end up with, you can go through the probability of each letter, each word in turn, and here's the letter. Finally, you end up with this. The probability of finding by chance this sequence, pro pare votis emerita, is 3 times e to the minus 20, which is about the same as 10 to the minus 10. So I think at this point one can rest one's case and say this dedication was very, very carefully prepared by the true author, and the true author is giving his name away. He's saying, these are, I am ever, I am E. Veer, and I think, to me, this is the end of the authorship question. We know who the author was because he told us who he was. Thank you.
Peter, as we're setting up, let me ask the first question. Just as a quick anecdote, about a year after your book, AKA Shakespeare, A Scientific Approach to the Authorship Question, came out, you and I were having lunch in California, and you were talking about the response to the book, and you said that you had sent a copy of it to every member of the faculty in the English department at Stanford. And I asked you what's their response, and you said, I haven't gotten a single one.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I said, how do you explain that? And you said, they're cowards.
I'm not sure I use that term, but...
And so what I'm trying to do is draw a parallel between the things we're talking about in terms of scientific models.
Yes.
And we're doing that with a certain bias towards certain fields. So in your field of physics, here's a dominant model, we're challenging it, et cetera, is the same process going on in the humanities? And are they not open to consilience by having you as an outsider come in and do this?
No, you've hit a very good point. It's very, very interesting. I mean, now we are physicists, etc., looking at something, a puzzle that involves the humanities, and we can say, oh, they're pretty dominant. They're not doing their homework. They're not open-minded. But the question is, supposing they had the capability to study what we're doing from a strictly scientific point of view, what would they be saying? I think we'd get a better response, but who knows? Yes.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I followed all the intricate details of your talk, but I just have a general reaction that when I work with texts and stuff, and I'm a writer myself, I find all these patterns.
Yes.
And I have a saying I've come up with, wherever you cast your obsessive attention, there shall you find weird patterning.
Yes, yes.
And however, the thing that I would question, I wonder if you question it, is the conventional assumption is if you find what looks like a very precise, improbable pattern, the conventional assumption is, aha, a human ego intentionally left that there.
Yes.
But what I found with the weird pattern, I mean, for example, they say if you want to tell if your tires are worn out in your vehicle, take a penny. If the tread reaches Lincoln's head, then you're okay. And it's just exactly a 16th of an inch from the perimeter of the penny to top of Lincoln's head, and he turns out to be the 16th president. Yeah. So it seems like an uncanny coincidence, but was that intentional?
Yes.
You see?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I find these incredible weird patternings that were left, by other people for me and so forth. But what I've discovered is that it doesn't look to me like in most of these cases a conscious ego intended it, but retrocausation, some kind of force working through the unconscious of multiple people, that there seems like there's something much weirder going on with these weird patterns. Yes. Have you considered other causal vectors besides a conscious human intention?
No, I haven't, but it's a big enough stretch to assign these cryptograms to the intention of the author. To say what had happened by some other agency is an even bigger stretch, so I'm not trying to push that.
Thank you.
But you're quite right. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.